Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Getting Political for Animals, a presentation of the Unitarian Universalist Animal Ministry. I'm Reverend John Gibb Millspa. My pronouns are he, him, and I live on the unceded land of the Kumeyaay, now known as San Diego. For visual accessibility, I'll note that I am a middle-aged white man with a brown beard and glasses, wearing a green shirt in my study. And I'm also the executive director of UUAM. UUAM has more than 40 established and emerging chapters across the continent, which each work on animal protection in congregations and communities. Some of them are focused on wildlife, some are focused on farmed animals, some on companion animals, some on all of those and more. And at a national level, and a continental level, we work to help UUs implement the new language that's at the center of our faith, adopted this summer through the support of UUAM, which says that UUs covenant to protect all beings from exploitation. One person who honors that covenant through many shifting political environments is my colleague and friend, Roland Halpern. Roland spends most of his time volunteering for Colorado Voters for Animals, working with lawmakers to help advance animal-friendly laws in the state legislature. This has included banning wild animal performances in circuses, increasing penalties for animal cruelty, and allowing citizens to enter locked vehicles to rescue dogs or cats in distress, to name just a few. Roland has also assisted in getting several city councils to ban pet stores from selling dogs or cats that come from commercial breeders, often known as puppy mills. He also chairs the Ethical Eating and Animal Welfare Task Force at the First Universalist Church of Denver, and he serves as a board member of UUAM. He's also the former program coordinator for UUAM. Following Roland's presentation, which will be around 30 or 40 minutes, there will be a question and answer session. And feel free, as Roland is presenting, to jot your questions as they come up into the chat for us to address when we get to the Q&A time. We'll read the questions that are in the chat, and you'll also be welcome to raise your hand during the Q&A session itself, either using the Zoom raise hand feature or physically raising a hand for us to notice and call on. So with no further ado, I turn it over to Roland Halpern.
Thank you, John, and welcome everybody. Again, my name is Roland Halpern. I'm an ordained animal chaplain. I'm a white, I guess I'd call myself an elderly male since I'm 72. I have gray hair, what's left of it, and a gray beard. And I am sitting on the land that used to belong to the Arapaho. So today we're going to talk about getting political for animals. And I just switched to an Apple computer, and apparently Apples and Windows don't mesh too well. And so John is going to be advancing the slides for me since we weren't able to get the screen share working properly. So without further ado, I guess let's go ahead and get to the first slide, which is the introduction slide. So basically, getting political for animals is just talking about what we can do on a local or statewide basis to advance animal welfare. I was sharing with John a little bit earlier, we as Colorado Voters for Animals don't get involved at the federal level because at the federal level, there's just too many legislators. There's too many conflicts going on. Right now, you have over 400 representatives, and you have to convince over half of those in Congress to move a bill forward. So that's like 218, which is a large number to get. On a local level, like in Colorado, we have 65 representatives, so we only have to convince 33, which is a lot easier. And in fact, most of the laws we've been able to pass here in Colorado have been the result of working on something that has been tied up in federal legislation for years. We passed a bill a number of years ago that's been introduced every year in Congress since 2015 and didn't move anywhere, and we were able to get it in 3 years through the Colorado legislature. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So we're a nation of laws, not of men, and I like to point out that it is laws that we're looking at. And one of the things we do with getting political for animals is we focus on passing laws, because then you have something that you can reference. You have something where if somebody violates that law, you can have repercussions for that. And so we look at laws rather than some of the other things. So let's go to the next slide. So why do we need laws? This is pretty much common sense, but I just want to go over it really quick. It regulates behavior. It establishes rules on how people are supposed to act in our particular society and can prevent certain behaviors. It also protects people. We have laws such as you have to stop at red lights, and we have laws governing work and other kind of things. It also maintains order. If you have some kind of laws in place, it tells people what they can do and can't do and kind of helps balance the social structure. And then, of course, can resolve conflicts. And we see this all the time in the courts where somebody goes in and a lawsuit is filed, and the law helps to resolve either in favor of the plaintiff or the defendant, depending. So let's go to the next slide. So these are just, and I'm not going to go through these in any detail, but these are just examples of federal laws that protect animals. And so we have the Animal Welfare Act, and if we did not have that Animal Welfare Act, we would have no repercussions, if you will, for somebody that was abusive to animals or doing things like that. The Animal Fighting Prohibition Act just had to do with cockfighting and other type of things and prevents those things across the United States. The Horse Protection Act had to do with soring, which is where with the Tennessee Walkers, they abnormally alter their hooves and things so that they get what's called the big lick, that big gait. And that actually is against the law, even though it's still practiced in Tennessee, and we're fighting on that. Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, transportation of animals, and of course, the recently passed PACT Act, which is the Preventing Animal Cruelty and Torture, and that was designed to stop these what they called crush videos that were coming in from overseas, where people would actually torture animals on video and then sell the videos to people who, for whatever reason, wanted to see that kind of thing. And that the PAC Act prevented that from happening, or at least making it a crime. Next slide. So we're talking about creating or changing laws, and we can jump to the next slide, John. And I like to point out that promises are not laws, and we get involved a lot of times with promises where a company promises they're going to do something or not do something, and that's just a promise. It's not a law, so it's typically not enforceable. Even if it is a contract promise, it only affects that one particular transaction and not a statewide or a nationwide basis. And this is just an example. Whole Foods had promised that they were going to basically get the Franken chicken meat off the shelves. That's the things that are, artificially, well, I shouldn't say artificially produced, but they're produced through genetic engineering and hormones and stimulants and things like that. And they had promised that they were going to stop doing that by 2016, and no progress has been made on that. So that was a promise that's unkept. If it were a law, there would be something that could enforce it, but with a promise, you really can't do much on it. Next slide. So we talk about protests really changing laws, and here I'm talking about protests within the animal welfare community. I'm not talking about these huge national protests like the George Floyd, which had millions of people involved in that. And certainly when you have those kind of numbers, it can work to change laws. But typically when we're dealing with animal welfare and animal protection, we don't have those same kind of numbers. This is just an example of a protest that's been going on for years here in Colorado against a place called Perfect Pets. They source their cats and dogs from puppy mills and kitten factories. And these individuals, some of them are from Bailing Out Benji and other organizations. Practically every Saturday, they're out there protesting in front of the store. And the store is continuing to sell the dogs and cats that come from commercial breeders. It hasn't changed anything they do. It might convince a couple of people not to purchase an animal there, but it really hasn't hurt the pet store's profitability, if you will. Now, I don't want to say that this is an exercise in futility, because it does raise awareness to some people. Here it got some television press, and so a lot of people who are watching television became aware of the issue. And again, they might decide they're not going to patronize that particular pet store. but it hasn't stopped the pet store itself from selling those dogs and cats. The other thing that protests can do is it can bring people together and you can form alliances. And later on, when you want to work on passing laws, you have people you know that are already on your side, if you will, that you can reach out to. So next slide. And petitions really change laws. Today, and I know every single day I get something asking me to sign a petition, either for care to cause or, any of these other kind of things. And all it is a click in most cases. Sometimes you can personalize the message, but a lot of times it's simply clicking on a link that sends something to a lawmaker. And the lawmakers have gotten so inundated with these, they call it slacktivism, meaning they realize there's not a lot of effort behind most of these, so they don't give it a lot of credibility. And they can't tell whether the person sending that message is one of their constituents. In other words, a person that can actually vote for them, or whether that person is even a US citizen or somebody from another country that's clicking on that. They really don't have any way of knowing that. And there's a group called Howl, HOWL, which specifically targets wildlife animal type things. And they've developed an IA program um, where basically 39 messages can go out from the same person to different lawmakers, and it will look like it's coming from 39 different people. So when you click on that, it sends a message to 39 lawmakers, and each one will be tailored a little bit differently, and it will give a different email address for each of them, because that's the way the algorithms are set up. So lawmakers can get inundated with thousands of these seemingly coming from individuals when it's actually being originated by one person. And that's why lawmakers are not giving a lot of credibility to it. In this example here, they were talking about brachiocephalic dogs. Those are dogs and cats that are intentionally bred to have short faces. They have all kinds of genetic problems, results in a lot of additional costs for veterinary bills, shorter lifespans, and whatever. And here, somebody wanted to go ahead and start this petition, but they've directed it to Congress, and only 70,000 is their goal, and that's not going to achieve anything. It's not even going to be noticed at Congress for that small a number. And it's not targeting an individual, which is one of the problems. You're just targeting a cause and you're not targeting your specific lawmaker. So let's go into the next one, John. And boycotts really change laws either. And this is just one of the examples of a boycott against McDonald's. Or it could be free range eggs. It could be the way they raise the chickens, all of those kind of things. And it doesn't really give McDonald's an incentive to change the law because people still continue to buy their, or I should say their policies, whether they have a policy in place or not. And they might agree, okay, well, now we're only going to source from cage-free for our eggs or whatever, but that's not a law. And what typically happens in these cases is even if a company agrees, okay, we're not going to buy eggs that come from commercial breeders, the ones that are not cage-free or pasture-raised or whatever, it doesn't stop another company from going in to fill that void. So McDonald's can say, okay, well, we're not going to do that anymore, but what stops another fast food company from coming in and filling that void because they can now offer a lower price for their product and people might be attracted to that lower price. And again, boycotts, while they rarely change laws, I mean, they do have a purpose in raising visibility. Some people may change their behaviors because of that. But again, it's not a law, and anything that the corporation agrees to can be changed at any time. And next slide. And we have situations where boycotts have even failed. This is a one up in Canada where they tried to boycott a festival where they had wrestling of slathered up pigs. And because of the boycott efforts, it actually turned out a record crowd that were not boycotting it. And so even more pigs were arguably harmed as a result of this effort to try and boycott the particular festival. So I don't want to say that boycotts and protests and petitions don't have their place, but they're really not something that is as solid as changing a law. And that's why Colorado Voters for Animals, a lot of the other organizations we work with, want to pass laws. We don't want promises. We don't want agreements. We don't want boycotts and so forth. Next slide, John. So Unitarian Universalist Norm Phelps, who died in 2014, wrote a book called Changing the Game. And he had for a long time looked at the animal welfare and animal rights movement. And I just thought this quote of his was really poignant. Ideology-driven movements are self-limiting. They can assemble a small, fiercely dedicated band of true believers, but without politicians, these believers will remain besieged behind the walls of their ideology. In animal liberation movements, when we pursue a strategy of abolition only, we are playing a game we cannot win. And so we must change the game by introducing political strategies. So Norm, who had tried for many, many years on all kinds of different things, realized that boycotts, that all of these other things weren't working, and realized that the only way we're going to be able to do this is through the political process. And he wrote a book called Changing the Game, and I'll mention that a little bit later towards the end, which I highly recommend because it goes through all the arguments. And he talks about all the great movements like prohibition and how that wasn't, able to change things because you can't take away from people things they like to do. And his point was people like to eat meat. And if you try and take that away from them, that's going to be unsuccessful if that's the approach you use. So you have to look at other approaches to change the game. And politics is part of that. Okay, next slide. So we're going to talk about the three main ways that laws get passed. There's other ways, but these are the three main ones that we typically deal with on a day-to-day basis. And that's by the ballot initiative process, through court rulings, and then legislatively. So let's go to the next slide, John. So by ballot initiative, it can be done in either of two ways. It can be done by the legislators themselves who concur an issue should be placed on the ballot for the voters to decide. And this often happens when they're kind of deadlocked on a piece of potential legislation and they don't want to make a decision for whatever reason. And so they say, well, it's not up to us. Let's let the voters decide. We'll put it on the ballot. And then there's voter initiatives, and those are where citizens can actually collect signatures to put a measure on the ballot. Now, that's not available in every state. If you look at these states that are in blue, those are states where you as a citizen can collect signatures to put an issue on the ballot for the voters to decide. The other states, you don't necessarily have that option. In some states, you have referendum only, which means if something is already a law, you can go ahead and try and change that law. You have the initiatives where, again, a lawmaker can put something on the ballot, but the individuals can't. And so this is only open to 26 states, and you'll note most of the states are out in the West, and Colorado is one of them, and that's why we do a lot of ballot initiatives out here for animal issues, and why you probably may not see them as frequently as you move east. Next slide. And then there's by court ruling, which is an interpretation by whatever court is happening to decide. And one of the problems you have with court rulings is it can change depending on who's sitting on the bench. And this is just an example of Roe v. Wade. They said that even though the Constitution makes no mention of abortion, the court held that it confers a broad right to obtain one. But then recently, as we all know, another Supreme Court basically said the Constitution again makes no reference to abortion, and no such right is implicitly protected by any constitutional provision. So here you have a court decision 1 year or 1 decade that determines it one way, and then later you have something that determines it another way. And that becomes a problem when you do something through the court interpretation, because it is subject to how the people on the bench see it and what kind of rules they're following. Next slide. And then you have by legislation, and that's where you go to the legislature. And this is just an example of a bill we passed in Colorado back in 2021, prohibits wild animals from being used in circus performances, roadside zoos, and whatever. And we did this legislatively. And the way this all came about, and one of the points I want to make is you as an individual have a lot of power. Almost every bill that Colorado Voters for Animals has worked on is when an individual citizen came to us, and in this case, it was somebody who had been to a circus. They saw these elephants being abused and said, this is really horrible. Isn't there something we can do about it? And it took us several years to put it all together, but we finally did all our homework, did all our investigations, found a lawmaker willing to introduce a bill. And it took us 3 years to get it through the legislature, but we were able to ban wild animals from performing in circuses. But this was an example of an individual coming to us with an idea, saying they recognized a wrong, and wasn't there something that somebody could do about it. We're doing the same thing with horse slaughter. There's a lot of bills we're working on where it's an individual that came to us with a problem or concern. And sometimes it's a lawmaker that will come to us and say, I'm having a problem in my particular district. And is there something you can do? Dogs are being tethered when the weather is too hot, when the weather is too cold. Can you help us introduce legislation that might address that problem? So we feel legislation is the best way to go under the current circumstances, and it's been the most successful for us. And we typically do legislation at the state level, but there's a lot of areas where we do legislation at the town or city level. And as an example, a couple of years ago, we tried to pass legislation on a statewide basis that would ban pet stores from selling dogs or cats that came from commercial breeders. I showed you that slide a little bit a while ago where that one pet store is continuing to sell those. Those laws did not pass. We got defeated by agriculture that said it's dogs and cats this year, but if this bill passes, you're going to be coming after pigs and chickens next year. And so there was enough support from the agricultural community to defeat it. So we changed the game. We changed our strategy. And what we're doing now is we're going to city councils and town councils in cities and towns where they don't have pet stores that sell dogs and cats. And we're getting ordinances passed that prohibit any future sale of dogs or cats in those particular towns and cities. And we've so far been able to pass it in 13. We're working on the city of Denver next. And the idea is we're working towards a critical mass. And once we get enough cities and towns to say we're not going to allow this, we're going to go back to the state and say, look, there's 30, 40, 50% of the towns and cities in Colorado are saying, no, it's time to pass a law on a statewide basis. So this has been an example. We do a lot of things locally. We were able to get a district attorney removed a number of years ago because he was not prosecuting animal abuse cases. And that was done on a local level as well. So while we focus mainly on the state, we will get involved in local things when we feel it's going to be to our advantage. Okay, next slide, John. So why do we legislate? Voter initiatives, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, they can be expensive. We just lost an initiative here that would have banned the trophy hunting of mountain lions and trapping of bobcats for fur coats. The opposition spent $7.1 million to defeat this effort. We're a grassroots group that were running it. We didn't have that kind of money. We were still able to come up with $4 million, but it wasn't enough. So these can be very, very expensive. And when I talk about voter initiatives, we're talking about putting something on the ballot. As I mentioned earlier, it's not an option in every state. I pointed out the blue states allow that option. Some of the other states don't. You have to get involved in advertising, mailing, phone banking, billboarding, whatever, to raise awareness of the issues to the people that are going to be voting. Requires a lot of public education. And if we saw anything from this past election, if you were watching TV, you would see these ads and you knew, no matter what side the ad was on, that there was something in there that was inflated, probably not true, was just being done for shock value. And so you have to spend a lot of time on public education and teach them really what the facts are to see beyond all that hype and rhetoric. And then there's signature gathering in Colorado. In order to get something on the ballot, we need about 215,000 signatures from registered voters. And that's a lot of signatures to go out and gather. And it differs in various states, but in Colorado, it's based on 5% of the people that voted for the Secretary of State in the last election. So it varies from session to session, but it's 200,000 is still a lot of signatures to be gathering, and they all have to be valid signatures. Court rulings have limited applications. They're subject to interpretation from one court to the next, as we saw in the Roe v. Wade versus the Dobbs thing. The statutes are going to vary by state, so there's not uniformity. There can be a very lengthy process. The court can rule on something that can be appealed. It goes to an appellate court. That might be appealed. There can be all kinds of things, and it can drag through the courts for years and years and years. And courts have a history of treating animals as property. Steve Weiss from the Non-Human Rights Project, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, used to say in the legal system, an animal is no different than a toaster. That's how it's viewed in the legal system. It's a piece of property. If that property is harmed or damaged or killed, what's the property worth? What's a toaster worth? If you paid $400 for your dog, that's what it's worth, $400. They don't look at the emotional support, all of the other things that can go into that. And we're hoping that'll change in the future. We have seen some progress with service animals, with police working dogs and horses. We've seen things getting elevated on a level where they're being recognized a little bit above the level of a toaster. But we have a long way to go until we show that animals really have rights that they should have. So next slide, please. So we legislate because animals can't speak for themselves. And interestingly or not, it's the only social justice movement in this country where the individuals that are being oppressed have no voice. And so we have to become their voice. If you look at women's suffrage, if you look at civil rights, if you look at a lot of these other issues, there were spokespeople from those marginalized groups that could talk out about those groups and explain why they were being marginalized and why it was so important for them to be recognized as being equal or whatever. Animals don't have that because they can't speak for themselves, at least not in a language we can understand. So we have to be their voice. And in fact, Colorado Voters for Animals, our registered trademark is a voice for the voiceless and a vote for the voteless. And that's what we try and do. Next slide, John. So we're going to talk about the process, and it's kind of convoluted, and I'm giving you the process light because there are so many rabbit holes that can happen during a legislative session. But I'm going to go over things like if it were a perfect bill and it perfectly sailed through, but then we can talk about a few of the rabbit holes afterwards. So next slide. So we almost every state is set up on a bicameral process. The only exception is Nebraska, where they only have a Senate. They don't have a House of Representatives or an Assembly or some of the other names it's called in various states. But under the bicameral process, every bill has to go through both chambers. So if the bill starts in the House and passes out of the House, it has to go to the Senate, and the Senate has to go through the entire process again, and both sides have to agree in order for that bill to go to the governor for signature. There's arguments for the Nebraska model saying, well, it only has to be heard once. You're not wasting time hearing everything twice. But the other argument in opposition is when you have a bicameral process, you have checks and balances, and something that might be overlooked or maybe not so desirable in the House can be corrected in the Senate or vice versa. So let's move on to the next slide. And John, this one is going to go click, 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 and there's a whole bunch around the clock. I'll just go next as we go along. So all bills start with an idea. And as I mentioned earlier, that idea can come from an individual like yourself who's concerned about something and wants to approach a lawmaker about it. We see ideas come from lawmakers who want us to help them pass something. Ideas may come as a result of a man-made or natural disaster. And so we want to enact a law now that will prevent that or minimize it from happening in the future. And sometimes ideas come from other organizations. Now, Colorado Voters for Animals is a 501c4, and I won't go into all the machinations of nonprofit organizations, but the typical nonprofits you think about that work with animals like ASPCA, Humane Society of the United States, whatever, they are structured as 501c3 charitable organizations. And because of that charitable status, they are very limited in the amount of lobbying they can do, the amount of influence they can do with lawmakers, and they're strictly prohibited from endorsing candidates for office. We structured ourselves as Colorado Voters for Animals as a 501c4 social welfare organization. So we are allowed to lobby extensively. We're able to endorse candidates. So the point being, some of these other organizations will come to us and say, we really have a problem, but we cannot approach the legislature on it because it would be considered lobbying or would exceed our lobbying limit. And would you take this on for us? And we've done that in a number of cases where we've taken somebody else's idea and been able to run it through the legislature. Okay, next click, John. So once that idea is introduced, the bill gets drafted and the bill gets introduced. It's called the first reading. And at that point, it is usually assigned a bill number and it will be assigned to a committee. And the committee normally has something to do with the bill. So if it's a bill regarding farm animals, it will probably go to the Agriculture Committee. If it's something involving insurance, it would go to the Business Committee and so forth. That's not always the case, but typically the way things should work is if it's something to do with animals, it should go to the Agricultural Committee. Next. So then you have the first committee hearing. Now in Colorado, by law, in the first committee hearing, it's open to the public and any member of the public can testify. They only give you 2 or 3 minutes, but you as a citizen are allowed to do that. In New York, you can't do that. They don't have these public hearings. You can write a letter to your elected officials in support or in opposition of a particular bill, but you don't have the option of going in and testifying before the legislature itself during the hearings. So you have this first committee hearing, and committee can be anywhere in Colorado. Committees can be as small as 5 members to as large as 13. And you have to have a majority of those members concur to pass that bill out. So if it makes that first committee hearing, next click, John, it then goes to a floor vote. And on the floor vote, it can be argued pro or con for that particular piece of legislation. Typically, that second reading or second hearing on the floor vote is a voice vote. So they just say, all those in favor say aye, all those opposed say nay. And I have been at hearings where the nays greatly outnumber the yays, but because of the person who was behind the speaker's desk or whatever supported the bill, they would go ahead and award it, even though the sounds were less, if you will. So it's just kind of a formality. The big thing happens in the third hearing, which is the next one. And so on the floor vote, the third hearing, there has to be an actual counted vote. So the previous one was just a voice vote. This one has to be every single individual has to be able to vote on it for it or against it. You can't abstain. You can be excused for medical reasons or whatever if you're not present, but you have to vote on that particular bill. Now, we like the floor vote for a number of reasons. It puts people on the record as to where they stood on a particular piece of legislation regarding animals. And we produce a scorecard every year at the end of the session, and we rank the lawmakers on how they voted on animal issues so that their constituents know were they animal friendly or not. So we really like the floor votes. I'll talk about postponements a little bit later. So let's say it makes it through this whole process. It gets introduced, gets out of the committee in the first hearing, survives the floor vote in the second hearing, and then survives the third. Then the next one, John, is the crossover. And this is where, let's say we started in the House, this is where it has to cross over into the Senate. Now, some states have a crossover deadline, and if the bill is not out of one particular chamber by that crossover deadline, it's automatically killed. It has to make the crossover date. Other states is more or less flexible. In Colorado, we don't really have a deadline for a crossover, but they still put it down as to when a suggested crossover should be. Next one, John. So now we have the whole process that's repeated. The only difference is they don't have to introduce the bill because it was already introduced in the first chamber, and they don't have to change the bill number because that bill number follows it through. So if it was introduced in our House, it's going to start with HB for House bill, and it would still contain an HB when it gets over to the Senate, even though it's now in the Senate. So, and John, we'll just do the next two real quickly because it's just the first committee hearing, the floor vote, and the third vote. And assuming it survives that third vote and there's no discrepancies between the two chambers, next slide, or next click, it then goes to the governor. Next click. And the governor in every state has 3 options. They can sign the bill into law. They can veto it, which would then require a 2/3 majority in both houses, both the Senate and the House, to overturn that veto, and that's kind of rare. Or they can ignore it, sometimes called a pocket veto, in which case it automatically becomes law after a prescribed number of days. So sometimes it's a way for a governor to say, well, I really didn't support that bill, but tacitly they did, and that allows the bill to become law if they didn't do anything with it. And again, this is in a perfect world, but let's say we get through the crossover. The other chamber decides, well, we like everything but this particular clause or this particular language or whatever. They make a change. That has to then be sent back to the originating chamber, and that process starts all over. And this is a tactic that's sometimes used to kill a bill because sessions can be very short. Some states have sessions that can be as little as 30 days in some years. Some states like California, they go the entire year. So it really varies on the states, but sometimes a tactic can be to say, well, we really like your bill. You know, it's a great bill. It really helps animals, but we have one little problem with this. And so we're going to send it back to you to see if you can fix that. And the clock might run and that bill might die. So it's just one of the, this is politics and it's one of the games that's sometimes used. Okay, next slide. So here are some of the rabbit holes. There's things called kill committees. And kill committees are normally comprised of legislators that have been voted in by a large majority. So let's say they won the last election by 80%. So regardless of how they are going to vote on a particular bill, they're not likely to lose their seat in the next election because they won by such a large margin. Here in Colorado, the kill committees are Veterans and Military Affairs. And we know if a bill goes to Veterans and Military Affairs, it's probably going there to die, unless it's actually something having to do with Veterans and Military Affairs. But there's all kinds of bills that find their way into Veterans and Military Affairs that have nothing to do with that, and they're intentionally sent there because they know that bill is going to die. It's just one of the problems that happens. You can have multiple committee referrals or another kiss of death. And they can say, well, we like your bill, but we think it's going to involve money, so we're going to send it to appropriations. And appropriations might pass it, but say, well, now we have to send it over to finance or we have to send it over to business for their opinion. And so you can run the clock on that too. All of these things take time. A lot of times hearings don't take place the next day or even the next week. And so it can take months for this to work its way through, and the bill can just die because the clock has been run. You can have delayed scheduling. When that bill is going to be heard is up to the Speaker of the House or the Senate, President of the Senate, or some other body, and they can say, okay, well, we're going to introduce this bill, but I'm just not sure when. And they can wait until a week before the end of session and then introduce the bill, and the chances of that bill getting through are next to nil because of the time it takes with notifying people of public hearings and things like that. I already mentioned short sessions where a session might be as little as 30 days in one particular year, which isn't really even enough for new legislators to even learn what's going on. But that happens. And then in years when you don't have money, and that happens quite often, you might have a really good bill, but if it's going to cost money, it probably doesn't even pay to introduce it because you can get it through all the processes, get all the people in to testify and everything else. But if there's no money, that bill's just not going to move forward. It will just die when it goes to appropriations. So those are some of the rabbit holes or the tricks that are sometimes used to delay a bill or to kill a bill or to prevent it from moving forward. Okay, next, John. So when we talk with lawmakers here in Colorado, and it's probably the same in your states, and we have two lobbyists we employ. We employ a Republican lobbyist and a Democratic lobbyist. And they go out and before a hearing even takes place, we get a vote count. And they go out to all the lawmakers on that particular committee and they ask them, are you going to vote in favor or in opposition to this particular bill? And so we know going into a hearing whether that bill is going to pass or not before the public hearing even takes place. And sometimes, as a result of that, we'll get a hold of the sponsor, the person who introduced the bill, and we'll say, look, we don't have the votes. Do you really want to move forward with this? Or should we wait and try and bring it back in a future year? Now, sometimes in election years, even though we know we don't have the votes to get the bill through, we may decide to force that bill through because we want to go down on record as to who supported it and who opposed it so that we can get that information out to constituents and they can see whether their lawmaker was animal friendly or not animal friendly. But the point being, in most cases, we know going into a hearing whether that bill is going to pass or not. And it's probably the same in your state. Lawmakers very rarely are undecided when, think of it as the voting booth. Most people are very much decided when they enter that voting booth. But there are a couple of things that can be said, even though we know that where lawmakers stand. Sometimes a lawmaker might be opposed for a particular reason, and we might be able during a hearing to introduce an amendment that fixes that problem. And we've had things where we've been able to move somebody from a no to a yes simply by changing a word shall to a word must, because they're two different legally terms. They're two different, but shall and must are not the same thing from a legal standpoint, and it changes the perspective of things. And so we've had situations where by changing a single word or maybe dropping a single section of that particular bill, we've gotten somebody to drop their opposition and the bill's gotten through. Bills can be laid over. So you can go in there, the hearing, a lot of things come up that you hadn't thought about, a lot of negative things. And you say, well, we know this bill's not going to move forward. Let's see if we can get it laid over so we can fix it and bring it back next year and address all of these problems. And then we have PIs, which are called postpone indefinitely. And that's where the bill is effectively killed, but it's not killed on record. In other words, you don't have a formal vote. So you can bring that back at a future session and start it all anew. So there's strategies in doing that because people can't look back and say, well, when you introduced that bill last year, it was defeated. Because a postpone indefinitely is not actually a defeat, even though it sort of was because the bill didn't move forward, but it wasn't a defeat with respect to somebody voting against it. And they can't say people didn't like that bill last year. So I hope that makes sense. It's um, kind of convoluted sometimes. And I've been doing this for 20 years. I've been through only three hearings where I've seen somebody change their vote. And in all three of those cases, it was the result of public testimony on a personal story and somebody saying, if this law passed, this is what it would mean to me. Or if this law had been in place, this is a tragedy that could have been prevented. And it's been enough to move one lawmaker or two lawmakers from a nay to a yay or a yay to a nay, depending on the nature of the bill. So there's definitely benefits to having public hearings, even though a lot of times we know what the outcome is going to be before that. But the other thing with public hearings is you can find out a lot of things you hadn't thought about. And I'll give you an example. In getting back to that bill we passed to keep wild animals out of the circus, we had a group that was opposing it. It was basically the trucking association, and they were afraid that if the law passed that they would lose business because they wouldn't be able to transport circus animals anymore. And that came up during a hearing, which is something we never thought about. But we got back to them and it became a moot point because all of the circuses have their own methods of transportation, either by rail or by whatever. So it wouldn't have affected them anyway. But it was something we hadn't thought about and it came up in a hearing. And when we went back the next year with that bill, we were able to make sure that that particular issue was addressed. And again, it took us 3 years to get the circus bill through. So things don't necessarily go through the first time. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3 or 4, or even 5 times to get it through. But you learn something each time and we just keep moving forward. Okay, next one, John. So I like to point out to people, you have something every politician wants, and that's your vote. And politicians will listen to you even if they don't agree, because if they don't listen to you, think about that on social media. You're going to post something saying, I went to talk to Representative Smith and he wouldn't even listen to me. He wouldn't give me the time of day. And a lawmaker really doesn't want that posted on Facebook or other social media because it makes him or her look bad. So they're going to listen to you even if they disagree with you. And it's also a numbers game, and that's something we need to realize too. And most lawmakers have a tick sheet in their office when a bill is being introduced, and they will record the number of support and opposition that comes in, kind of what we used to call a Benjamin Franklin chart, where you have two sides and you put all the yeses on one side and all the no's on another side. And if the yeses overwhelmingly outweigh the no's, the lawmaker's probably going to go in that direction because that means there's probably more constituents that are going to vote for him or her in the next election. Not always. There's no hard and fast rules, but it is something they look at. So you do have power, and I want people to know that. And as I mentioned twice already, some of the bills we've gotten passed was the result of a single individual coming to us with a problem that we were able to take and run with and get a lawmaker to introduce it and pass it. Next slide, John. And this is a quote from Mick Mulvaney that he gave to the Washington Post a number of years ago, just to give you an idea. He had a hierarchy in his office. If you were a lobbyist who never gave him money, he wouldn't talk to you. If you were a lobbyist who gave him money, he might talk to you. But if you came from back home and sat down in my lobby, I talked to you without exception, regardless of the financial contributions. Because again, they don't want to look bad. They don't want people saying, I tried to talk to my lawmaker about this problem. They refused to talk to me. They refused to listen. So keep that in mind. Okay, moving on. And this is just something I like to show, basically shows constituent influence by type. And this was put together by the Congressional Management Foundation. And the blue shows efforts by an individual like yourself that have had a lot of positive influence on the way a lawmaker decided how to act on a particular piece of legislation. And you can see an in-person visit is the most important thing. It had the most overwhelming influence on a particular lawmaker. And if you put the lot of positive influence with some positive influence, personal visits, 94% had influence. Um, Contact from constituent representatives, that came in next. I'm not going to go through all of these, but contact from a constituent representative would be somebody representing maybe a group. So I have a special interest group, might be the Audubon Society, Sierra Club. Somebody from that group went out and talked to that particular lawmaker. All the way on the bottom, you're going to see form, email, message, only having a lot of positive influence 5% of the time. We talked about the slacktivism and the fact that lawmakers don't even know if you're voting for that particular lawmaker or whether you're even in the United States. And even if it's an individualized email, you can see at least that had 30% positive influence. But the point is, it has to be something personalized. It can't be one of these things you just click on because that's not going to get a lot of support from lawmakers. Okay, next slide, John. So things to talk about, we're kind of doing a slight deviation here, but some things I wanted to bring up as you move forward. The issues in the terminology and the situations are going to differ depending upon where you're located geographically and also politically. So I'm going to be talking about a couple of things to think about. They may work in your area, they may not. You're going to have to find out what works best. There's certain terms we use here in Colorado that might not work in another state. So let's move forward. So one of them is animal rights versus animal welfare. Animal rights right now in Colorado, at least, is negatively charged. They associate the word rights with a lot of other rights things that people might support or might not. Gun rights, abortion rights, all of these kind of things. And so rights in itself, just that word, has a possibility of turning somebody off. Just from the word, they don't even listen to you beyond getting to the word rights. So here we talk about animal welfare, we talk about animal protection. It arguably can be the same thing, arguably not, but that's the words we use here, animal welfare and protection. And a lot of times we use protection because welfare also is beginning to get negatively charged. Not animal welfare, just talking about welfare in general. And, should people be entitled to welfare? Why can't they go out and get a job, et cetera? And so we run into those problems. So it's just something to think about when you're talking with lawmakers. And we at Colorado Voters for Animals, when we talk with lawmakers, we always talk about animal protection or animal welfare. Okay, next slide. And these are just some things to think about. And this is by no means an extensive list, but just sort of things that we found here that we use. So instead of ban, we talk about a prohibition because, again, ban is negatively charged. Abortion ban, gun rights ban, all of these other kind of bans. So we talk about prohibiting something. And that seems to be a little bit softer than saying we want to talk to you about banning this. We want to talk about possibly prohibiting this. Obviously, with animals, we don't like to refer to them as it or them or other things. We talk about him or her or who. And any chance we have to put a name to an animal rather than a number, we try and do that because we're trying to move them more to, I shouldn't say more towards human, but that's actually what we're trying to do, to move them more to being recognized as sentient beings and being something more than a toaster. We're toying with using guardian rather than owners, and some people use this. Some people just think it's really silly to talk about being an animal guardian rather than owning a pet or a guardian of that pet. But we're trying to use that occasionally into the language, and we're hoping that over time we can make that become the common language rather than owner. So that's just something we're using here. We don't like to talk about non-human when we don't have to. We talk about fellow animals, fellow creatures, whatever. And creatures, even that can be a negative kind of things because some people think of a creature as being less than human, being something, bad or whatever. So again, that's a word that may or may not be appropriate depending upon your circumstances. There's all kinds of things like harvest, cull, we like to call that out and say, you're not harvesting the animal, you're killing it. You're not culling the animal, you're slaughtering it. We just like to call a spade, if you will. And for the same reason, we talk about cows, not beef, and we talk about pigs, not pork. These are just kind of all kinds of things you can talk about. And then we're finding any more vegan and vegetarian sometimes are having negative connotations. And there was a study done, and I brought this up in something I was doing on a Funalytics presentation a couple of weeks ago, where a company was marketing something as a vegan product and the sales were not doing well. And they simply changed it to healthy product, and the sales shot up 40% simply by changing vegan to healthy. Same product and whatever, but again, it's just something you need to think about when you're using those kind of terms. So next slide, John. So we really do have a red brain and a blue brain. This is really kind of interesting. They've done a number of studies on this, and they continue to do it. And they find that conservatives versus liberals translate into Republicans versus Democrats view the same issues differently. And we don't know whether that's a result of the way you're brought up. If you were brought up in a Republican family, do you tend to be Republican versus being brought up in a Democratic family? Does that happen when you're older and you go to college or whatever and you get exposed to these ideas? The jury's still out on that one. Next slide, John. So here they did an experiment, and they took this group and they just had this kind of experiment where, and this was given to liberals and conservatives, same kind of questions. There were questions where they were assured a reward of 20 cents for doing something, or they could do risk taking and they might lose it all, or they might gain 40%, or they might lose it all, gain 80% or whatever. And they found out with the Democrats or the liberals, whatever, they had greater activity in the region of their brain associated with social and self-awareness. And for the Republicans, they found there was greater activity in the region involved with fight or flight, which we would call fear. And if you look at a lot of the issues today that are Republican issues, a lot of them are based on fear, fear of immigration, fear of this, fear of transgenders, fear of all kinds of other things. And one of the interesting things is these researchers were able to just look at the MRIs, not knowing beforehand whether the person was conservative or liberal. And in 83% of the cases, just by looking at the brain scan, they could accurately tell whether the person was a Republican or Democrat based on how that brain scan came out. I think that's really fascinating. Next slide. And this is just, again, from that same study, and you can see they're saying that Republicans value agency and Democrats value communion. And this is just something to think about. And we look at this when we go in and we talk with lawmakers on a particular piece of legislation. And if we know it's a Republican we're talking to and we know they're motivated by fear, we try and approach that talking about, well, you really don't need to be afraid because, or we look at other aspects. Versus if we go to a Democrat, we're going to be talking about community and we're going to be talking about, how this benefits the community, how it benefits the workers. In the case of farm animal type things, it's more humane not only for the animals, but for the workers because they're not exposed to all of these kind of things and so forth. And we really do our homework. And I don't want to go way off on a tangent, but we use things like VoteSmart and Ballotpedia, and we look up beforehand to see any background information on that individual, what groups they belong to, how did Planned Parenthood rank them, how did Sierra Club rank them, and it gives us some background and insight into the individual, and so we tailor basically the way we're going to approach each individual. It's not a one size fits all. So next slide, John. And the gender makes a difference too. And this is another study that was just done this year that was reported out. And it had to do with showing a video of caged hens that were used for laying eggs versus free range or whatever you want to call it, if there is such a thing. And basically, and I'll read it, after watching the video, only women showed higher levels of agreement that chickens suffer in the egg industry. Only women. It didn't really affect the men. And if you look at, and well, you won't be able to see what we've done in Colorado. I would say practically every single animal welfare bill we have passed initiated with a female sponsor. And the reason I bring this up is if you're working with city council, if you're working with legislators, keep that in mind and try and find a female sponsor because that individual is probably going to be more compassionate, more sympathetic, and more open to listening to you. I'm not saying that there aren't male sponsors that are going to do that, but studies like this, and it's not the only one, there's been dozens of them, kind of bears that out. I sit on a number of committees, and sometimes I'm the only, on a committee of 30 people, I will be the only male, and everybody else on that committee will be female. So it's really kind of interesting, but we see that, and knowing that it's something we have to exploit. Okay, next, John. Also, never burn bridges, and this is particularly important in this time, especially following the election. We work both sides of the aisle, and I have friends, Republican friends. They invite me out to their ranches. We go out for dinners. We go out for things like that. We have never agreed on a single issue, but what it has done is it's toned down the rhetoric. So when we're at a hearing, when we're at a discussion, we're not attacking each other. We're disagreeing with each other, but we're not attacking with each other. And the pendulum swings both ways. Sometimes you'll have the Democrats in control, sometimes you'll have the Republicans. And if you only side with one particular party when that pendulum switches, you're not going to have any friends on the other side that you can talk to. So we never talk about extremes. We never dig our heels in and say it's this way or no way. We always try and reach consensus, or where can we agree on something? Is there anything we can do to advance animal welfare and protection? Might not be what we wanted, but any step in the right direction may be a step forward. And I've just given some examples. We have elected officials who are red meat eaters, and they support factory farms and CAFOs and everything else, but they like dogs and cats. If I alienate them just because of where they stand on meat eating and farms, if they're on a committee that's hearing a bill on puppy mills, I need their vote. And if I've alienated them and made them so opposed to me that they're going to vote against it just because it's me that's introducing the bill or speaking about it, it's not going to go anywhere. So I need them. Same thing with hunters. We have hunters that, and I personally don't agree with hunting, but we had a situation here in Colorado a number of years ago with killing contests. And that's where people go out on a day and it's just whoever can kill the most coyotes wins a prize. Whoever can kill the most foxes wins a prize. They're just going out there. It's a blood sport. They're not doing it for food or anything else. And we actually had some hunters who came forward and said, that's not hunting. We oppose this. That is not hunting. That is not sport. And if we hadn't had their voice, we wouldn't have gotten that passed, because these were people that were actual hunters. So it wasn't just us as bleeding heart liberals coming in. We had hunters who hunted who said, this is not hunting. So we needed that. And again, we don't want to burn the bridges and say, well, you hunt, I don't want to talk with you, get away from me. And elected officials, there's one I'm really good friends with. He has a cattle ranch. I'm not real crazy about it. I've been out there visiting with him a couple of times, but he really believes in the humane treatment of the cows on his ranch. And he says that, my cows, the only bad days my cows have is the day they're slaughtered, versus a factory farm where the only good day a cow has is the day it's slaughtered. So next slide. So these are a couple of books I think, that I use. These are kind of my Bibles. One is Getting Political for Animals, and that's kind of how the title of my presentation was based. And this was written by Julie Lewin, who's a friend of mine. This book is now out of print, but a lot of times, don't go to Amazon because it's always too expensive on Amazon. But I go to a place like Adol or Half Price Books, and you can usually pick it up for as low as $3. But it's really a blueprint that we use a lot of times for how to approach lawmakers on a local basis to get things through. And every time I see it for $3 or $4, I buy a copy and I give it to some of our members who want to get involved in this. And the other one I mentioned earlier was Changing the Game by Norm Phelps. And again, he's for years had been looking at all kinds of ways to advance the things for animal welfare and protection, and ultimately decided we're only going to be able to do it if we do it politically. And John, I think that's the last slide. I think that takes us to Q&A. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Roland. That was simply an excellent presentation. I'm going to open up the chat here. It looks like we have at least one comment. Oh, the first question is, can we have a copy of the presentation?
It's been recorded, so I don't have any problem with it. We
I
did
think
record it, didn't we, John?
we are recording it. I
Okay.
imagine this person's asking for a copy of the PowerPoint.
Oh, yeah, I don't have any problem with that.
Okay. Um, Nicole, if you send a request to info@uuam.org, info@uuam.org, I will be happy to email you a copy of the PowerPoint. So you can ask questions in two ways. One is Zoom has a React button, and if you click that, you can click raise hand, and then Zoom will raise a hand for you, or you can also just physically raise your hand, and I'll be looking through for folks. The first question is from Julia.
Hi, so that was a great presentation. Thank you very much. One thing that I've thought a lot about, and it might be beyond, the scope of what you think is realistic based on what you've said about the federal government, but I do a lot of advocacy around plant-based eating, and the subsidies that go to big ag and particularly animal agriculture are, just staggering. And I'm interested in, I spent 3 days with the UUs for Social Justice a year ago last September. They lobbied in DC for the Farm Bill, and I was with them, along with Farm Action and another nonprofit organization that they partner with. And even in that context, it seems like nobody wants to talk about the subsidies. Do you see any way to make progress on that issue?
It's a great question, Julie, and it's very difficult. And I'll just give you an example of Colorado. Beef and meat exports are probably, if not our single largest domestic product, the second one. And you're not going to, the uproar would be so great, and it has been. And it's a real problem. And if people really knew what it cost to buy a pound of beef, they would be priced out. I mean, it'd be twice or three times what it is what you're paying at the supermarket. But and again, getting back to Colorado, if we were to do something like that, you're putting thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not more people, arguably out of business. And so the government looks at that, the lawmakers look at that, and they say, well, it might be intended, but we have to look at the long-term consequences, and this could just be devastating for the economy. And a lot of times, unfortunately, is about the money. And that's one of the reasons we try and do things locally rather than on a national basis. But subsidies is one that is a tough one to tackle. You're going to have people saying, well, then people aren't going to be able to eat. They're not going to be able to afford protein. And, meat, everybody needs it. It's what's for dinner. Pork, it's the other white meat. You got to drink your milk. You've got to, do all of those kind of things. And I wish I had an answer for you, Julia, but I don't. That is a really tough one. If you find out an answer, let me know. And I will add, if anybody at any time wants to contact me, they can simply email me. And depending on what state you're in, I also belong to an organization that we formed called CASEO, which is basically the Consolidated State Animal Advocacy Organizations. And we have representatives now in about 20 states that are similar to Colorado Voters for Animals, and they're just local groups that do nothing but focus on legislation in their state. And we meet periodically and we exchange information. And the idea is not to reinvent the wheel, so that if somebody says, well, we're going to be introducing a bill to do this, I can say, well, we already passed that here. Here's my whole file. We're doing your homework for you. You don't have to do it all over. And conversely, we might be doing something and they have information on it. And the whole idea is we're stronger as a group passing out that information than people starting all over from scratch. So, but feel free, to contact me on any questions you have, either after this presentation or anytime in the future. We have a lot of resources. I've been doing this for 20 years and I've compiled lots and lots of information, and I have buckets on almost every single issue, even though they might not be issues that are appropriate for tackling this year, next year, or 10 years from now.
We have just a clarifying question in the chat. Could you please repeat the group of consolidated state to state group?
Yeah, it's just CASEO. So it's CSAAO. And it's actually the Coalition of State Animal Advocacy Organizations. But you're not going to find it. We don't have a website. We're not incorporated. It's just a group of people that get together that represent animal advocacy organizations that exchange and share information. But if you are from a state where we do have a representative, we can certainly contact you with that particular member.
Thank you. Let's go to Nicole.
Yes. How do you make friends with hunters? Because I usually walk away.
Yeah, and you know, I used to too. And when I first started getting involved in this thing, it was kind of like this. I'm over here, they're over there, and we're never going to meet. And when you have that absolutist thing, and this is what Norm Phelps was talking about, you're never going to get anything because they're not going to change their mind. You're not going to change their mind. So we talk about if it's hunting, and I'm anti-hunting, but I understand if somebody is hunting to feed their family. You know, if they're actually using the animal for some kind of purpose, I don't support that necessarily, but I'm not criticizing it either. I'm not saying, oh, you're a bad person just because you're trying to feed your family. And it's just kind of meeting in the middle and talking to them. And it's like you would meet anybody else. And it is a process. And sometimes it's just going up during a hearing and saying, you know, are you still hunting? Or what are you hunting with? Or hunting season's coming up. Are you going to hunt this year? Something like that. And that just kind of breaks the ice. And then you can start talking about it. Or when are you going to give up hunting? You know, and I sometimes say to hunters, you know, I've read that at some point all hunters say, there's been enough killing. I have to stop. You know, when are you going to get to that point? You know, without being too offensive about it. And again, hunters can kind of be your friends. I talked about the situation where we actually had hunters testifying in support of something we were trying to pass because they said that's not hunting. That's not fair chase. That's not, you know, that's not getting an animal for your family to feed your family. That's just killing for the fun of killing. So,
Thank you.
you know, it's the same thing with cattle ranchers, Nicole. You know, that's difficult too. But you can talk about, well, I'm glad you treat your animals kindly. I'm glad you're looking out for your animals and being careful with them and giving them room to roam in the field and eat grass like cows are supposed to do rather than eating corn, which is not a cattle food out of a trough. So you can compliment hunters or farmers or ranchers on the things that maybe they're not doing right, but they're doing better. And that can kind of make you friends with it. I don't have any enemies at the Capitol, and there's a lot of Republicans who are hunters and ranchers, and none of them are enemies. We might not be close friends, but we do talk and we do joke, and you know, and it avoids that rhetoric. You don't have them attacking you, saying, "Oh, you're just one of those PETA people." So I hope that answered the question.
Thank you.
It's all about relationships. It really is. And I'll give you one, you know, another example just for relationships. We're working on passing a ban in the city of Denver that would prohibit pet stores from selling dogs and cats from commercial breeders. And people have been trying to get the city council to do something for years. I happen to have a personal relationship with one of the council members. And I went and visited him a month ago. And I said, Chris, you know, we got a problem here. Here's what I'm hoping you would do. And he's already sent a bill off to drafting, an ordinance off to drafting. It's taken these other organizations like years and nothing happened. And because of that personal relationship I have with him, we've already got something sent off to drafting. So a lot of times it's personal relationships, and you never know where those relationships are going to come. And I've had ranchers text me during hearings saying, well, how should I vote on this? I mean, literally. And they're looking for my opinion because they trust me, because they know I'm not a PETA person who's like got this one agenda and I'm going to try. We don't do gotchas. We're very transparent and we tell people where we're coming from. And if we disagree, we tell them why we disagree. And that's another thing, be honest. That would be one of my biggest takeaways is just be honest. Don't try gotchas. You might win one year, but you've broken so many trusts at that point that you're never going to regain that trust.
Thanks, Roland. Let's go to Katie.
Hi. Yeah, I just want to kind of throw in on that same question too, that most of us were raised in the same culture as hunters and farmers, and we ate meat, probably most of us, when we were coming up. And so it helps to kind of keep that in mind, that you weren't always the vegan or whatever that you are now, that was the process, and other people need to kind of be, when they can be, helped to that process or through that process. And my field is rhetoric, and kind of the major principle on that is that you can't convince anybody of anything if there's no identification between you. So finding some kind of common ground, as Roland was talking about, okay, well, you don't like this, and I don't like that, but maybe we both like this, that making that kind of identification can be really helpful. And again, we can, and I've been guilty of this, we can be very dogmatic, and that does the animals no good at all, because all you're doing is turning those people off probably further away than they were when we started. So
Yes,
that was all I wanted to say. Thanks.
yeah, that's a great point, Katie, and it brings up a piece of legislation we worked on a number of years ago called COLA, which is the country of origin labeling. And we actually testified in support of that, even though it had to do with beef and pork and all of those other kind of things. And our argument, for supporting that bill was, we don't know how they raise animals in Argentina or Brazil or these other areas. They may not have an animal welfare act. They might not have these other things. And so, if we support that labeling, people are more likely to buy from states or countries that have laws that are at least giving some level of protection to animals. But that went a long way, because here's Colorado Voters for Animals, everybody thinking we're these PETA people, whatever, and we're in there testifying in support of an agricultural bill to label meat. And that gained us a lot of respect, and it still remains to this day. So that's an example of what you were talking about. We were able to find common ground on a particular issue. Obviously, I would have preferred that people don't eat meat to begin with, but we supported that, and it helped. So great point. I'm glad you brought that up. And, a lot of times when I'm talking with people, I talk about Venn diagrams and things like that, where you draw the circles and you try and figure out where you overlap. And I say, well, here, we do have something in common. That overlap might be like a really small piece, but it's something, and that's a place to start. And it might be on having clean water for your animals, or protection, from the sun or the environment or whatever. It could be any one of those things.
Other questions? Nicole.
So mine's more of a day-to-day kind of thing. So yesterday, in between watching Hallmark Channel movies, the TV went back to the football game that was on, and it happened to be the exact same time, Louisiana, where they brought out the tiger. Ugh. How do you not, because I'm gonna get emotional. Keep it in my state, but even then it's I've not gotten involved in this because of the emotional piece of it.
Yeah, there's a lot of controversy percolating up about the tiger, and here in Colorado, they have a buffalo. The University of Colorado has a buffalo as a mascot, and we argue that it's a wild animal, and they're arguing, well, it's a domestic animal because people raise buffaloes now for food or whatever. The only thing that works with that, and that is one area where maybe a protest would work, where if enough people contacted the school and said, this is not how we should treat animals, this is a wild animal. It's not a question of if it gets loose, it's a question of when it gets loose and then what's going to happen. And maybe approach it from that standpoint. And if you can get enough people, like starting a petition, maybe, on change.org or something, that is one thing where a petition might actually help. The other thing is, you could look at a city ordinance that would ban the use of wild animals in events, and that is another approach that might even gain traction. You know, something to think about. There could be ways you can work around things. You know, we've seen cities like
Like that's not even my state.
yeah.
Like
We saw, you know, like if in Pittsburgh where they passed a bullhook ban. Bullhooks are these like looks like a fireplace poker. They use it to control elephants, and so they passed the ban on the use of bullhooks. Um, and basically, circuses didn't go there anymore because the only way they could control the elephants was a bullhook. So it wasn't a law banning circuses or an ordinance banning circuses. They looked at one particular device that was used to control the animals. And by banning that, which was a lot less controversial, because you're saying all we're doing is banning the use of this thing, we're not banning circuses. Circuses moved out of town. They didn't show up there anymore. So there's different approaches you can use if you kind of look at some of the things and get creative.
Nicole, I heard your question as being partly about emotions and what to do with the strong emotions that come up as one
yeah,
hears
that's
these
part
books.
2. Yes.
Yeah, and emotions really don't have a lot of place in politics.
Right.
We tend not to think clearly. I mean, passion is different than emotion. But when we get emotional, sometimes, you know, in so many of the letters to the editors I see, and so much of the stuff I see posted on Facebook is emotion.
Mhm.
You know, it's knee-jerk reaction, and then, you know, people slap themselves on the forehead later and say, "Why the hell did I say that? You know, what was I thinking?" And I see that time and time again. And I never post any, you know, I write things out first in Word before I post anything, and I read through it and I read through it. And then I say, do I really want to post that? And I try and look at it. How's it going to be perceived from both sides? And is it going to do more harm than good, or are people not going to be against me because of what I said? So yeah, emotions can be, yeah, can be bad. They get us hyped up. They get us angry. I've seen so many emails where people, it was obvious they were so upset they weren't even spelling right. They were just typing something in furiously, and words were wrong, and sentences were wrong, and yeah, that's why I do everything on the side before I post anything. So I don't know if that answers the question.
I have to befriend the hunters, which are my literal neighbors here in New Hampshire, and I'm not from New Hampshire, so from Connecticut. So this
Yeah.
hunting thing is very unsettling here in the state that I now live in. So it's a lot.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I feel the same way, you know, like I'll be out hiking and I'll see people by the creek fishing, and,
Mhm.
you know, I'll go catch anything, and I'm hoping they didn't. But it's just, you know, trying to have a little dialogue there. And then, you know, oh, I understand fish can really suffer. Did you know that? You know, sometimes you can interject that into the conversation. And they'll say, oh, well, we're just catch and release.
Ugh.
Well, that's okay, but you know, sometimes, you know, they are injured and you release them and they actually don't survive. So and I try not to be like really bad about it, especially if there's children around, um, that the parents are teaching the fish or whatever. I don't want to really alienate people like that, but I sometimes want to do a little something that will get them maybe to thinking about it. I did a
Thank you.
presentation once at church about where our food comes from, and we were talking about bacon. And when the kids realized that bacon comes from a pig, one of the kids kicked his parent after the service, saying, you know, you took me to McDonald's this morning, we had bacon. So, you know, and that wasn't well received. So,
Helena asks in the chat, what kind of budget do you work with? For example, how much do the Democratic and Republican lobbyists cost?
so our annual budget is around 150,000. Most of that comes from an annual fundraiser we do that includes an auction, and then we get some small grants, but not many. One of the disadvantages of being a 501c4 is if you give us money, it's not tax deductible, so we don't get foundation grants and we don't get government grants. But our lobbyists are really good. They're really animal lovers. They gave us a discount. We pay collectively $60,000 a year, and that's half of what they normally charge. But they are so in tune with what we're doing that they agreed to cut their price in half. So they're basically almost working, you know, at cost. but they're real animal lovers. So we were really good at that. We did find that we really can't get anything done without lobbyists. We tried for a number of years. One of the advantages you have of lobbyists, and again, we have a Republican and a Democrat, so they can get in to see the Republican legislators and the Democratic legislators. But one of the biggest advantages is they can go in to talk to somebody on a bill that's totally unrelated to our bill. So I have one lobbyist who represents the vintners, the people that grow wine and produce wine. And she can go in on a bill that's going to talk about viniculture. And while she's in there, she can say, oh, by the way, did you hear about this bill that Colorado Voters for Animals is working on? What do you think about that? And so it gives her an opportunity to bring something up, whereas we would never be able to get in to talk to that legislator because animals have nothing to do with, wine production or that kind of thing. So that's part of the value. The other value is they're picking up little bits and pieces, when they're in the bathroom, when they're in the hall, when they're whatever that I might miss. And they can come back and say, hey, I overheard this. We need to be aware of it. We need to address it or whatever. So you as an individual can't do much because you're a one-trick pony, whereas a lobbyist might be representing 5, 10, 15 different organizations or whatever. And each touch, if you will, gives them an opportunity to talk about what we're doing and to kind of get the pulse of the lawmaker on how they feel about it.
Other questions?
And again, I'm always available. Something might come up. You might next session have a bill come up and you'll want to know something about it. And like I said, we've researched probably every issue you want to think about: pesticides, rodenticides, balloons, releasing balloons into the atmosphere, horse tripping, tail docking, you name it. And some of these we're not going to be able to work on, but we have a bucket, if you will, that's got all of this research information so that if that ever comes forward, we're not starting from scratch. We already have a lot of research we can pull from.
Well, thank you so much, Roland, for sharing all of your hard-won experience and expertise with us. I know it helps me feel a little bit more equipped to engage in a very shallow reflection of the very deep work that you're doing. And thanks for offering to be available to us as we go forward as well. It's an incredible service to animals that you're doing, and your presentation and your offer are an incredible service to this community.
Well, thank you. And again, the takeaways I would give you is you have a lot more power than you think to talk to your lawmakers. And we have to be willing to compromise. We have to be willing at least to move the needle forward, recognizing that where we want to be is a long, long ways off. And if we just continue to be at opposite sides, we're not moving towards the goalpost at all. So even as unpalatable as sometimes it might be, we feel any step towards improving animal welfare is a step in the right direction. So it may be getting egg-laying hens out of battery cages. And, that's not where we want to be, but it is improving the lives of the animals a little bit. And we think that that's better than just saying we're going to leave them in the battery cages until all of the egg producers agree that everything's going to be pasteurized, pasture-raised eggs. So. Okay, well, thank you all for joining.